The first sign something was wrong wasn't the machinery. It was the sound. A deep metallic crash rolled across the trees behind my property before sunrise, the kind of noise that instantly makes you stop whatever you're doing and stare out the window. At first, I figured somebody had jackknifed a trailer on the county road again. Out where I live, weird stuff happens often enough that you learn not to panic too quickly. But about 20 minutes later, when I drove down the gravel lane toward my barn, I realized this wasn't somebody else's problem. There was a flatbed truck parked halfway onto my land, and stacked beside it were massive steel support beams. Not one or two, an entire load. I remember sitting there with both hands on the steering wheel, blinking at the scene like maybe my brain hadn't fully woken up yet. The driver was already lowering the last beam, while two workers stood nearby drinking coffee as casually as if they'd done this 100 times. I rolled down my window. "Hey, you guys at the wrong property." One of them glanced over. "Nope. Delivery order says this location." Then he turned away. That was it. No epaligi. No confusión. No concern whatsoever. Just complete confidence that they belonged there. And honestly, that irritated me more than the steel itself. See, that land wasn't just another investment property. My name is Caleb Turner, and that piece of ground outside Pine Ridge, Washington, had belonged to my family for almost 40 years. My father bought it after a logging accident nearly ended his career. Every overtime shift, every side job, every dollar he could scrape together went into paying for that acreage. Growing up, I spent summers repairing fences, clearing brush, and helping him rebuild the old equipment shed after storms. After he passed away from cancer 6 years earlier, I couldn't bring myself to sell it. Some people inherit money. I inherited memories. So, standing there watching strangers dump industrial steel onto that land felt weirdly personal. Like somebody had walked into my father's living room and kicked their boots up on the coffee table. I got out and walked toward them. "You can't leave this here." The older worker shrugged, called the developer. Then the truck pulled away. Just like that. 5 minutes later, I was standing alone beside thousands of pounds of steel that absolutely did not belong on my property. The company name was spray painted across one side of the beams. North River Development Group. Fancy name. The kind of company that builds luxury condos where perfectly good warehouses used to be. I called immediately. A receptionist answered. Professional voice. Perfect manners. I explained the situation. She listened. Then she said something that would end up costing her company a fortune. "Oh yes, that's temporary staging material for the Harbor Point project." Temporary staging. I almost laughed. "Ma'am, this is private property." There was a pause. Then she replied, "We'll look into it," and hung up. That's when I should have realized what kind of people I was dealing with. The next day, nothing happened. Then another day. Then a week. The steel remained exactly where they'd left it. Rain soaked it. Mud collected underneath it. Meanwhile, nobody from North River called. Nobody emailed. Nobody showed up. It was as if they'd simply decided my property now belonged to them. My neighbor Walt found the whole thing hilarious. Every morning he'd drive by on his ATV and yell, "Hey Caleb, how's the steel business?" I laughed along with him at first. Then I stopped laughing, because the longer those beams sat there, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a mistake. It was entitlement. A large company had looked at a rural landowner and assumed he wouldn't fight back. And maybe 10 years earlier they would have been right. But losing my father changed something in me. Grief has a strange way of sharpening your sense of respect. You start noticing who values your time, who values your property, who values you. And every day those beams remained there felt like a reminder that somebody thought none of that mattered. On the 12th day, I drove into town, paid for certified mail, and sent North River Development their first formal demand letter ordering removal of every piece of steel from my property. Looking back now, that was the moment everything changed. Because until then, it had been an inconvenience. After that letter went out, it became a war. The funny thing about dealing with powerful companies is that they rarely come at you head on. Most of the time, they just wait. They stall. They delay. They convince themselves that regular people have mortgages, jobs, family problems, bad knees, doctor appointments, and eventually they'll get tired enough to stop pushing. North River was clearly betting on that. 2 weeks passed after my certified letter. Nothing. No response. No removal crew. No epaligi. The steel sat exactly where it had been dropped, slowly turning darker under the constant Washington rain. Every morning, I'd walk out with coffee and stare at those beams while the fog drifted through the pines. Sometimes I catch myself talking to them like an idiot. You boys planning on moving anytime soon? The only answer was rain-hitting steel. One afternoon, Walt drove, over carrying a six-pack and a bag of gas station sandwiches. We sat on the tailgate of my truck looking at the pile. He whistled. You ever think about what all that stuff is worth? I shrugged. A lot, probably. No, he said. A whole lot. That conversation stuck with me. Not because I cared about the value at the time, but because it made me realize something. If the steel was valuable, then somebody inside North River absolutely knew it was sitting here, which meant they weren't ignoring me because it didn't matter. They were ignoring me because they didn't think I mattered. That's a completely different thing. That night, I started researching. And let me tell you something. County websites are apparently designed to punish human beings for using them. 3 hours of broken links, outdated PDFs, and legal language later, I stumbled across something interesting. Then I read it again, then a third time. Then I printed it. There is a section buried deep inside county property regulations dealing with abandoned commercial materials. The wording wasn't exactly exciting, but the basic idea was simple. If commercial property was left on private land after formal notice and the owner failed to reclaim it within a specified period, ownership could potentially transfer through legal abandonment procedures. I remember leaning back in my chair, staring at the screen. My heart was pounding, because suddenly this wasn't about removing steel anymore. The entire situation had flipped upside down. The next morning, I called someone who actually understood this kind of thing. Her name was Rachel Boone. Rachel owned a salvage yard outside Pine Ridge and knew more about construction materials than anybody I'd ever met. Tough woman. Smart. The kind of person who can negotiate with truckers, lawyers, and scrap dealers before lunch. I explained everything. Long silence. Then she said, Caleb, if that statute applies, you better document every single thing. Every single thing. That became our mission. For the next week, we treated those beams like evidence in a murder investigation. Photographs, videos, measurements, inventory records, copies of every notice, certified mail receipts, date stamps, weather records, everything. Rachel brought a yellow legal pad and spent half a day writing down serial numbers while I measured beam lengths. At one point, she looked up and said, You know they're going to lose their minds if this goes through. I laughed, but the truth was I was nervous, because normal people aren't used to fighting corporations. There's this strange psychological thing that happens. Even when you're right, part of you feels guilty. You start wondering if you're being unreasonable. You question yourself. You imagine all the ways things could go wrong. North River seemed to understand that perfectly. About a week before the deadline expired, I got my first call from someone higher up the food chain. A man named Evan Cross, Regional Operations Director. Even his title sounded expensive. His voice was smooth, controlled, professional, the kind of voice that probably closed million-dollar deals over steak dinners. Mr. Turner, we've become aware of a misunderstanding regarding temporary storage materials. A misunderstanding. That phrase immediately irritated me. 5 tons of steel on private land wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision. I told him the deadline remained unchanged. There was a brief silence. Then came a small chuckle. Not friendly, condescending. Mr. Turner, I don't believe you fully understand the legal and financial implications involved here. I remember standing in my kitchen looking out at the rain and suddenly feeling completely calm. No, Europea. I think I do. Then I hung up. Rachel laughed so hard when I told her she nearly spilled her coffee. Oh God, she said. You actually hung up on him. I did. That's amazing. But underneath the humor, things were getting serious. 3 days before the deadline, a black SUV drove slowly past my property just after midnight. Then it came back. Then it passed again. Walt noticed it too. The next afternoon, another representative showed up unannounced. Expensive loafers, pressed jacket, wrong shoes for mud. He walked around photographing the beams without introducing himself. I stepped outside. Can I help you? He barely looked up from his phone. Assessing inventory. Inventory. The word hit me like a slap. Not my property. Not my land. Not my rights. Just inventory. As if the entire situation existed solely from their perspective. You planning on removing it? I asked. He shrugged. Not my department. Then he got back into his luxury SUV and drove away. That was the exact moment every remaining ounce of sympathy disappeared. Until then, Some part of me had still believed maybe this started as an honest mistake. Maybe paperwork got mixed up. Maybe somebody entered the wrong coordinates. Maybe there was confusion between contractors. But not anymore, because honest mistakes get fixed. This wasn't a mistake. This was arrogance. And arrogance has a funny way of making people careless. Meanwhile, the story was spreading around town. Apparently, I had become known as the Steel Guy. The cashier at Miller's Market asked about it. The county clerk recognized my name. Even the barber brought it up during a haircut. Small towns are basically social media with tractors. Everybody knows everything. Everybody has opinions. And everybody was waiting to see what happened next. Finally, the deadline arrived. Gray skies, cold rain, typical Pacific Northwest weather. I loaded a thick binder of documentation in my truck and drove to the county administration building. Every photograph, every witness statement, every notice, every receipt, weeks of preparation sitting beside me on the passenger seat. Walking into that building felt strange. Part excitement, part anxiety, part disbelief, because even then I wasn't entirely sure this would work. The clerk spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing my file. Page after page, photo after photo, receipt after receipt. She looked up once and asked, "You collected all this yourself?" "Every bit of it." She nodded, kept reading. More silence. Then finally she reached for the stamp. The sound echoed across the counter. Claim accepted pending final review. At that moment, my stomach dropped, because suddenly this wasn't theoretical anymore. This was real, very real. I walked back to my truck feeling like I had just stepped onto a roller coaster after the safety bar locked into place. There was no getting off now. And somewhere inside a corporate office, North River Development still had absolutely no idea what was about to happen next. The approval came through the following afternoon. I remember checking my phone 3 times because I genuinely thought I had misunderstood the email. Then I opened the attached documents. Read them once, read them again, and just sat there in silence. According to the county, the abandonment claim had been approved. Legally, officially, completely. The steel now belonged to me. For nearly a minute, I just stared at the screen while rain tapped against the kitchen window. It felt ridiculous. Like one of those stories you hear from somebody at a backyard barbecue and immediately assume they're exaggerating. Except this time, I was living it. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was worried anymore. Honestly, it was excitement. The kind that keeps replaying every conversation in your head while you stare at the ceiling at 2 in the morning. By sunrise, I was outside drinking coffee beside the beams. The fog hung low across the property. Everything was quiet. Then I heard tires. Fuss tires. Aggressive tires. A black Escalade came flying through the gate so quickly it nearly slid sideways in the mud. The driver's door opened before the vehicle fully stopped. Out stepped Evan Cross. And, judging from the look on his face, somebody had finally informed him exactly how expensive this situation had become. He marched straight toward me. No greeting. No introduction. No attempt at professionalism. "What the hell did you do?" I took another sip of coffee. "Morning to you too." That didn't help. His face turned even redder. "You filed an ownership claim on commercial construction materials." I filed an abandonment claim. Those assets belong to North River. I shrugged. Not according to the county. For a second, he simply stared at me, like his brain was struggling to process the fact that somebody outside his corporate world had told him no. Then came the familiar transition. Anger shifted into forced calm. I've noticed powerful people do that when intimidation stops working. They lower their voice, straighten their jacket, pretend they're suddenly interested in cooperation. "Mr. Turner," he said, "let's be reasonable." Reasonable. Funny word. I'd spent more than a month being ignored. Now, suddenly everyone wanted reason. "You received 3 certified notices," I said. "There were internal delays. Not my problem. This creates serious financial complications." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because the irony was impossible to ignore. For weeks my concerns hadn't mattered. Now, these were apparently an emergency. Evan took a slow breath. Then he made the mistake that told me everything. "Name your price." Just like that. No apology. No acknowledgement. No accountability. Straight to money. As if every principle in the world existed only until a checkbook appeared. I reached into my jacket and handed him the county approval documents. He grabbed them, started reading, and I'll be honest, Watching his expression change was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. First confusion, then disbelief, then panic. Real panic. The kind people try desperately to hide. This can't be right. County says it is. You can't legally acquire active construction inventory. I pointed at the paperwork. Apparently I can. Rain started falling harder. The steel beams glistened behind us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. And, standing there watching him stare at those documents, I realized something. The money wasn't what bothered him. The loss of control did. People like Evan spend their entire careers believing rules bend around influence, attorneys, and budgets. What truly upset him was discovering that sometimes they don't. Eventually, he handed the paperwork back. Slowly, carefully, jaw clenched tight. This isn't over. I folded the documents. Feels pretty over to me. A few moments later, he was gone. The Escalade disappeared down the road, mud spraying everywhere behind it. 10 minutes later, Walsh showed up on his ATV. Apparently, he'd witnessed half the encounter from across the road. Was that him? I nodded. The big corporate guy? Yep. Walt started laughing so hard he nearly fell off the seat. Caleb, I swear this is the best entertainment this county has had in years. The crazy part is what happened next. 2 days later, Rachel connected me with a buyer interested in structural steel. The negotiations moved quickly. Inspections happened. Paperwork cleared. Money transferred. And here's the twist nobody saw coming. The buyer turned out to be a subcontractor working on the exact same development project. North River had become so desperate to replace the missing materials that one of their own contractors ended up purchasing the steel. Legally. Fairly. At market value. When everything finalized, a little over $14,000 landed in my account. $14,000. All because a corporation decided private property rights were optional. I used part of the money to replace the roof on my father's old equipment shed, something he talked about doing for years before he got sick. The rest went into savings. Because life has a way of humbling people the second they become too proud of themselves. As for North River development, things didn't exactly improve. The Harbor Point project suffered delays, then financing problems, then legal disputes. Depending on who you ask, there were a dozen reasons. Last time I drove through the city, construction was still incomplete. Cranes stood motionless against the skyline. Fences surrounded half-finished structures. Millions of dollars frozen in place. And every now and then, I find myself wondering whether Evan Cross ever thinks about that morning when he drove onto my property expecting to intimidate somebody. Maybe he does. Maybe he doesn't. The truth is, I don't really hate those people anymore. For a while I did. But eventually I realized the steel was never the point. Respect was. To North River, my property looked like empty space on a map. To me, it was decades of memories. My father's sweat. My family's history. Every fence post we'd repaired. Every storm we'd survived. Every lesson he ever taught me. That's what they failed to understand. And honestly, that's why this story still sparks arguments whenever people hear it. Some folks say I simply stood up for my rights and held a careless corporation accountable. Others say I took advantage of a legal technicality and profited from somebody else's mistake. Maybe there's a little truth in both perspectives. So now I want to hear from you. If a company left valuable property on your land, ignored repeated warnings, dismissed your concerns, and only showed up when the law stopped favoring them, would you have done the same thing? Was this justice? Was it opportunism? Or was it simply accountability arriving with a very expensive bill? Let me know down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you stand on it. And if you've ever dealt with a situation where a powerful company thought the rules didn't apply to them, share your story too. Some of the best lessons come from ordinary people refusing to be treated like they don't matter.